Hey folks, thanks very much for joining our Monday Mindshare, and real treat today to both formally welcome and announce, of course, Dr. Mikki Williden to join SFuels, and thanks for joining our Monday Mindshare for the first time, Mikki.
Leighton, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity, and I love this. We're going to dig into a study. We're going to talk about it in context. We're going to geek out a little bit, which,
Yeah,
is
exactly.
something I do. I love it.
Well, that's why we love having you part of the team. Is pretty much our whole team is full of geeks in different aspects of the company. So you're going to fit in so well. Look, it's just been a fascinating time more recently with different studies, right? And we're going to jump in here soon to just some of the very recent studies that came out, which is kind of contrasting different findings, if you will, on fat oxidation, substrate oxidation relative to performance in endurance sport. But maybe before we do, I thought it'd be good just quickly, Mikki, just give some background to, your work in some of the papers. I know you've written and been part of a number, but particularly in substrate and carbohydrate manipulation.
Yeah, thanks, Leighton. So, I've been a clinician for over 20 years, an endurance athlete for 35 years. I have a real passion of both endurance nutrition and also performance and health. And as a runner myself, these topics are sort of near and dear to my heart, if you like. Uh, so with regards to the type of research that I've been involved in, I was up at AUT University for a number of years, and also supervising PhD students,
Okay.
or being involved in the supervisory team that looked at fuel manipulation and substrate use. So
Okay.
there's a real changing of the guard in this area over the last 15 years or so, and it's as more studies come out, where increasing our body of knowledge. But I think
Yeah.
with every new study, we have to put it into context with other known, other research. Like, it's not just one study. There's a context behind it, and there's a body of literature behind it, and how well it marries up to that literature.
Yeah. No, well said. And I mean, you come, of course, from a country that is such a pedigree in endurance sport, but it feels like New Zealand also is punching way above its population size in terms of research in this area too. So there's
Well, I
just a
feel
real kind of concentration of awesome endurance athletes and research going down in your neck of the woods.
Yeah, I feel really fortunate actually for that to be the case, and not just New Zealand itself, but up at AUT University, where we
Right.
had the likes of course, Dr. Dan Plews, we had Professor Paul Larsen,
Yeah.
we've got Professor Andrew Kilding, Ed Maunder. We've got a range of people who
Yeah.
have an interest in this. And when I say interest, everyone has their own bias, because we're all human, but everyone is interested in understanding better and questioning things and in
Sure.
challenging things, but also accepting, what the research sort of shows. So yeah, no, it's been great.
And a number of them have been very active in several aspects of, I guess, SFuels' interest on research and really double clicking on, I guess, what would you say, theories or hypotheses, probably more so. And then it took time to work out whether it's true or not. And I think maybe jumping into this discussion about what Dan was studying, there's a very recent research paper just come out actually this last month, and really it was a paper around I'll just say carbohydrate um, use in training and racing, and then contrasting that to, if you will, a periodized carbohydrate view. And Dan's paper, which I'll bring up on screen here, was really just actually commending the paper, or I should say that the research, if you will, on just the overall structure of the research. And Dan has always had a very balanced view on and analyzing these research papers. But he did spend a bit of time on really looking at the protocol of what was applied in the way of substrate use for the periodized group. And the way he titled it, like it says it on screen here: right fuel, right time, wrong protocol. And we're going to come back to this actual study, Mikki, but I felt like it would be good for us to step back and let's look at all the big papers that have happened over that kind of, 5, 6, 7 year period, that really kind of have shaped a lot of the thinking here with respect to the concept of manipulating substrates for performance outcomes. At SFuels, we talk about right fuel, right time, but in essence, it is about what substrates, how much, and when. It's essentially what we're talking about. So I won't, I'll get people, we'll put the links to Dan's blog, well written as usual, and encourage people to take a look at that. But any comments you would have at a high level on the key kind of messages that Dan was bringing out in his blog?
Yeah. Well, first, just to sort of contextualize it, even just from a clinical perspective, like I think it was 2018, there was a paper coming out. A paper came out from, I believe, Sam group, and it was fuel for the work required. And it was this idea of carbohydrate periodization, not just within day periodization, but sort of across a training cycle to give athletes, coaches, nutritionists a better sort of understanding of how we might manipulate macronutrients to support the goals of that particular training block or training session. And from the research at that time, it was we understood that you got a clear upregulation of fat oxidation enzymes when you trained sort of in absence of glucose, in certain sessions. So, and to be able to upregulate those enzymes just enhanced endurance adaptations for an athlete. And of course, it's all very scientific, but that's the best way, I guess, to describe it.
Yeah.
And then there were different sort of protocols for that. And within the protocols, of course, you talked about low carbohydrate as a rule, fasted training as a rule. Like these both helped enhance, as methods. But being able to periodize carbohydrate, so you went into a session supposedly glycogen depleted, it was going to help enhance it, but then you would add back in carbohydrate post session. And so there was really good structures on sort of how to do that. And then of course subsequent studies around that time also found that manipulating substrate use helped enhance that fat oxidation pathway in the body and helped increase our ability to burn fat.
Yeah, and we'll go through some of those studies. I think let's just say the job's never done. We keep evaluating and optimizing and tuning how we do this best. And maybe just on screen here, just for everyone's benefit, when we talk about right fuel, right time, we're really just talking about using certain substrates at specific times and specific amounts in the purpose of improving oxidation to support endurance, aerobic development, glycogen retention, etc. These are the things that obviously help underwrite better performance. But we will also touch on, Mikki, in some of these studies, which I feel is maybe more recent, is some of the health implications also that come about as a function of, let's just say, hyper consumption of carbohydrate, which very recent times has become a bit of a thing. Because some of these studies, and I think maybe just the technology is catching up to help us really understand this, like, continuous glucose monitoring and things like that. So now there's two questions that I think today we really want to answer as we go through these studies. The first is really the question of, does manipulating, fuel nutrition or substrate oxidation, like, correlate with performance and for that matter, health outcomes? So that's question one. And then if it does, what are the factors and methods that are seemingly at this point of research observation most productive on driving that change? And secondly, maybe even what are some nutrients that, if consumed too much, could actually be counterproductive, if you will, to substrate oxidation? So they're the two questions we'll try to answer. And Mikki, I'll bring up on screen as we go through this, the research papers, and I'll just highlight the research and maybe you can make some comment on the study and takeaways, and we'll have some backwards and forwards.
Yeah, no, that sounds really good, Leighton. And I feel like, when I'm talking to, just again, from a clinical perspective, when I'm talking to an athlete about endurance performance, we often talk about, the limiting factors in performance, right? And also what helps enhance performance. And if you look at like a long endurance event, like an Ironman triathlon, the people who perform the best aren't the ones necessarily that speed up during the race. They're the ones that don't slow down.
Yeah.
And one of the sort of limiting factors with being able to maintain that pace is your ability to utilize all fuel sources. And if you are constantly relying on just one source, so you're going out in every training session and it's in your sort of peri-training period, you are having just carbohydrate or different sources of the carbohydrate, because we know that carbohydrate helps performance. I mean, that's well understood. Sure. In context, right? But you're just absolutely locking that door on the hundreds and thousands of calories of fat that even the leanest endurance athlete would have access to if they just increase their fuel utilization. And that's what you see in, we're thinking of one of the first papers that you're going to be bringing up, like a key determinant in performance in Ironman triathlon.
Yeah, that's a great lead in to exactly that. This first paper in 2017. So, going back 7 or 8 years, and it's maximal fat oxidation. I mean, this is the title, is related to performance in Ironman triathlon. Now, I would maybe a few nuances here. 61 athletes, all male, which actually, when we get into some other studies, you'll see that that is a factor, actually, sex on oxidation of substrates. You can see the age here, 23 to 47, a fairly widespread of different VO2 max levels, which also is obviously a key determinant of performance. And they're testing for, fat oxidation, substrate oxidation. So why don't you talk us through high level the substrate, the study takeaways, and then we'll maybe just chat a little bit about this.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, the major takeaway with this really is that the higher your fat oxidation and the higher your ability to utilize fat as a fuel source, the better you perform in an Ironman triathlon, which is, I mean, anyone watching this is probably likely to go, yeah, that makes sense to me, because it's an endurance, sport, and it's, plays into exactly what we're sort of talking about.
Yeah, and I think it's worthwhile pointing out that, Ironman triathlon, if you look at it, in fact, if you go to the Ironman website themselves and they talk about what is the typical performance intensity relative to VO2 max that Ironman racing is done at, and this is for the, the broad age grouper, they call out the 70 to 75%. And this is not about, what would happen if you were doing 400 track intervals, right? It's a very different energy system. But we are talking about, let's just say the 2 hour right through to the multi-day type of sport, right? And all the different types of sport that happen in that endurance context. So good baseline. Just where I think one of the interesting studies began was this study by Frandsen. Yeah, so the second study, Mikki, is very, very much recent. It was like middle of last year, thereabouts. Fairly interesting because where a lot of the studies, of course, in this area are done in labs, they were using more quite modern, if you will, metabolic, research and capabilities to study, if you will, in the field or real world analysis. And this was like in training and also during racing. And this particularly was with respect to, Grand Tour UCI level cycling, professional cyclists. And this particular study was looking at then the signatures out of this metabolomics approach on how much aerobic, anaerobic exertion was happening during training or during racing, to truly try to understand the relativity or the correlation between those signatures of things that were in the blood relative to performance. I think the training session, the whole team was like 28 athletes, but then of the 28, took 5 into, I think it was a 7-stage, 7-day race.
Amazing.
So yeah, maybe you can touch on some of these. I've gone deep in the study. I think it's a fascinating study. But yeah, what are your takeaways?
Yeah, so I guess that the sort of high level takeaways really is just that this is, a really promising technique, isn't it, for being able to assess fuel substrate during an actual event, plus also training, you know. And I love the fact that they did both an in-field, because so often you can do something in a laboratory which isn't, it does translate to real life, but there are so many other factors that sort of play a role. And unsurprisingly, what I feel unsurprisingly is that when they were doing their sort of test, looking at that high intensity sort of interval training, which was a graded sort of approach, you had, you know, obviously you had some fatty acids, but lactate obviously plays a role there as well. You know, the higher the intensity, which we know that to be true. But then when you're looking at that zone 2, much higher fatty acid utilization, which is to be expected. And it was really nice that you could see this within the methods they used. Yeah.
It was interesting in one part of the study where they talked about the 7th stage, or the 7th day of the race, was longest and had the most elevation change. And particularly the finish of that stage was really the major, if you will, rise of the day to finish that final stage. And you'll see that this point that's made actually even in the abstract, in the conclusions here, around that the signatures of elevated fatty acid oxidation correlated to, you know, the best competitive performance. But they also highlighted that last stage and the nature of the finish being that, you know, let's just call it more VO2 max, high intensity characteristics, they felt like is because those athletes were mostly or more so using fat during the bulk of the race. They had available glycogen to work with at the latter end. And this is something I feel like, you know, folks have been in the lower carb space have talked about this concept of glycogen retention, and there's been mixed views on it from a science perspective of whether it really happens. It's really interesting that in this study where they're looking in the field, in racing, this detailed metabolomic study, that they're suggesting that is exactly what is happening.
Yeah, and I think this is the thing which which I really found fascinating as well, because to truly, like, because of course a large part of the glycogen story, the gold standard way to figure that out is to do like a muscle biopsy, but you can't do that in real life. I mean, there's no way that they're going to want someone digging into their leg after each stage of a like a 7-day event. So yeah, this was really good for me. But anyway,
I agree. I think the metabolomics work will continue to bring out whatever the truth is that we find at the end of the day. But empirically, and again, just going back to 2018, where we first started working with Dan, if you go back and look at his splits of the 42K in Kona, you'll see almost it's not identical, but it's like seconds of difference between the kilometers from the beginning to the end. And, you know, we've worked with Matt Kerr in New Zealand, and what happened in Utah was very similar. There was very little tapering off to the point you made right at the beginning, which this is more about, you know, holding a pace through the end of the race. So anyway, interesting data. So there's 2 studies, one in 2017, one in 2023, really starting to call out that, hey, we think there is a correlation between the ability to have healthy, efficient fat oxidation, and that supporting the concept of improved performance, and then this concept of glycogen retention. So then we let's jump across now to then, and starting with Jeff Rothschild's work, and this was a couple of years ago that it was published, and this was more of a studies of studies, if you will. I think he didn't say it was a meta study, but they looked at essentially 8,000 athletes. They had to throw out half of those. They didn't fit within the requirements having consistent data. But anyway, 3,500 athletes, 434 studies, and it's a number of, you know, highest impact influences to fat oxidation outcomes. And then there were other factors. So maybe you could chat through some of those, Mikki.
Yeah. So, I mean, the major takeaways from Jeff's work really was that dietary fat, habitual dietary fat intake was a key influencer of fat oxidation. Exercise duration really made a difference as well. So the longer you went, the more the longer the session or the longer the duration, the higher the fat oxidation. Sex played a role as well. So males more likely than females. And so they were the major sort of takeaways. And of course, there were other ones as well. But from a modifiable perspective, what you ate habitually, plus carb intake around training. And that exercise intensity were like key sort of modifiable factors.
Yeah, and Dan's team down at AUT did some work and published it, I think it was maybe a couple of years ago also, where he specifically zoned in on this construct of, the nature of what is taken prior to the workout, what would happen to fat and carbohydrate oxidation. And that was, again, very clear that carbohydrate had a blunting effect in that workout if it was high prior to the session. Conversely, protein and fat had very little effect on blunting fat oxidation. So it was quite consistent with this work by Jeff. So that was one. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to, and also in exercise and duration played a role in that study as well, in that the longer you went, the less important it became. So if it was a long session, then it appeared not to have the same blunting effect as what it would have had if it was a short duration type workout, which I found really interesting too.
And just to be maybe for everyone's benefit, just to kind of, I probably should have called this out earlier. We talk about fat oxidation, but in a lab, of course, you talk about respiratory exchange ratio, and essentially you're saying that as that measure of the exchange ratio decreases, that's a proxy or a measurement that fat oxidation is increasing, correct?
Yeah, that's right. That's correct.
Okay. So with that, let's go into the next study. And again, this was there's actually one study, but there were two papers that came out of this, kind of looking at different lenses on the same data. I think if I'm not wrong here, Mikki, you've actually had Philip Prince, who was leading this study, onto your own podcast and talking to him about the depth of this study also, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Because I mean, this sort of is near and dear to my heart, the whole performance/health aspect of the habits and behaviors of endurance athletes, just because I myself see many in this sort of middle age bracket, which if you think about, if you went to Ironman website and look at the statistics for the people that complete or participate in the sport, we're age groupers, you've got like point however many percent are absolute elite, but the majority of us are just out there doing it because we love it, and we want to do it for as long as we possibly can. And so Philip Prince and I talked about the potential health implications of the high carbohydrate approach for athletes like us who are wanting to perform at their best, but also understand that this is a lifestyle sort of choice.
Right. And you actually have another life outside of training.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just about like winning anything. It's like, can I, compete at my best, recover, and then do it all again for the next 30 years?
Right. Yeah, exactly right. Well, I'm going to jump in on some of those aspects in this study on the health implications. I think a few points about the study that makes it really interesting. So sure, they absolutely looked at fat oxidation, and this was actually done with quite high intensity. In fact, I think it was Track 8800s. I think they used as a testing platform for this. But yeah, they were still looking at what happened to fat oxidation. But for everyone's benefit, the setup of this was two groups on a lower carb, and I would say this is truly a more classic lower carb, meaning I think it was like in the 50, 60 grams per day range. And they contrasted that with a classic high carbohydrate protocol. But what they did is they did both groups on this diet protocol, and then they switched to crossed over, right? And they looked at what would happen to that. They also had continuous glucose monitors on these athletes, which I thought was a marvelous way to really understand, whether just because of what we were seeing when we did our VO2 max substrate testing, well, there's another aspect to look at, which is glycemic control. And it became a real call out and finding of the study, which I think is what you were alluding to earlier. So maybe there's a few call outs here and takeaways from the study. Maybe you can talk through those first.
Yeah, and I think like one of the major ones, which I think is important, is from that health perspective, is that 30% of the participants sort of entered into that pre-diabetic range when they were on a high carbohydrate approach.
Right.
And interestingly, those same subjects, when they switched them to be low carbohydrate, they had the most to gain from that improvement in fat oxidation. So I think that's excellent and promising news from a performance perspective for them. But the fact that they were pre-diabetic during that high carb approach, which actually wasn't ridiculously high carb either. Like we're not talking about 9 grams of carbohydrate per kg of body weight. It was, if I'm not mistaken, more around that sort of 5 or 6 grams per kilogram of body weight. So, it's fairly typical sort of carbohydrate intake for an athlete who is sort of following athlete guidelines, if you like. So I think that was one of the major ones, take home from the health perspective, at least.
Did it surprise you as a nutritionist and, again, practicing clinician for a long time that on one hand, 1 in every 3 was measuring pre-diabetic on one hand, but secondly, this is only a 4-week study. So in other words, it's hard to say what all these athletes were doing prior to going to the study, but in that 31-day period, which is the duration of the test, 30% then registered as pre-diabetic. Is that surprising to you as a clinician? And
yeah, I wasn't surprised by the number of people, but I was surprised by the rapidity of it. Like it was very rapid. You're right. But equally, I think there's real. I think a take home from this could be for some people looking at this who may be in a similar position, is that there's quite a clear and rapid solution. Like it's not rocket science as to how you might reverse some of these things. And I think that's a really important message too. Yes, this was a terrible state to get in, but actually diet manipulation is a powerful tool to improve metabolic health. And then along with it, you're going to improve your performance. Like that's a huge thing, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe just to put an edge on that, we did a video with Dan in the early, I think, first year, working with Dan on, I think it was Ironman New Zealand, or it was a 70.3 in New Zealand. This is prior to going to Kona. And what we did is, his classic race day protocol obviously had high carbohydrate, as a lot of athletes do. And what we looked at is the subsequent 2 weeks after that. And it was, extremely erratic. It took 2 weeks for it to come back to, if you will, a more classic, stable, predictable, within range glycemic control. So as much as this study in 31 days shows that you can quite rapidly get into that pre-diabetic state, even just race day, and I'm not confused on the role of carbohydrate, glucose, and fructose on race day, but obviously the question is in, day out impact of that, and we're going to get into some of that in a few studies.
Yeah, and what I would say as well, Leighton, is that the implications of running higher blood sugars aren't just the metabolic ones that you can't see. Like these are real energy concerns that an athlete may experience in that day-to-day life of training that they might just put down to training fatigue. And then when they feel fatigued and their blood sugars crash, the first thing that their brain tells them to do is get more sugar, which is carbohydrate, because carbohydrate breaks down into sugars. So when I say sugar, I mean, it could still be whole wheat bread or whatever, but to bring that blood sugar back up to within a normal range. And so it's this perpetual cycle of sort of energy crashes. And whilst we were kids, we would recognize when we had like a bit of a sugar high, like, we all sort of probably experienced that at one point. Yeah. But as athletes, you don't get that now. But what we do get, and as adults, I'm sorry, but we do get is that sort of that crash, except we misunderstand it and think, I'm training, I should feel this tired. And I think that's something else that we need to highlight.
Misinterpretation, yeah.
Yes, you don't need to feel that.
Well, this next study is actually on the same study, if you will, but it's other research they did during the same study, and this was really specifically looking at, and it's the same researchers, but Tim Noakes kind of led this paper being published, and it was more in the spirit of, if you will, challenging some of the classic premises, if you will, of exercise science. As it relates to, what substrates burn at what intensities. And maybe I'll just talk through it, and then we can have a chat about it. But basically, the classic premise is as you get to, over 60% VO2 max, your energy is, mostly coming from carbohydrate. The majority, more than 50%, is coming from carbohydrate. So that was the first premise. Second one was, that fat oxidation hits its highest point below that crossover, below that 50%, where it's 50% fat, 50% carbohydrate. Your maximal fat oxidation happens before that. That was the second premise. And the third one was that, fat oxidation is, in fact, if you look at some references online, they talk about it, it basically goes to zero. And they were, challenging those 3 points. And it's really fascinating what they found in this study when they really, looked at, again, having both CGM and also the VO2 max side by side. It's these exercise science constructs are really getting challenged with some of this.
Yeah, they are. And, and this is how science should be, right?
Right.
You read a textbook, it tells you something, and then there's emerging data to suggest that this isn't in fact how it is. And I believe that that Volek's group back in 2016, maybe one of the first published studies in this field, in this area as well, looking at endurance runners, like very well adapted to a low carb / ketogenic diet, showing fat oxidation rates of sort of 1.6 to 2 grams, which is like very similar to what they found in this particular study here. And I think this really highlights that you can still go at a good high intensity and burn fatty acids. And that's the real premise of a lot of that high carbohydrate model of sports performance, is you cannot burn fat at a higher VO2 max. And this clearly shows that that's not the case.
Yeah, and I mean, outside of the study itself showing that actually you can be burning very high rates of fat at those high intensities, one of the projects we did after we had worked with Dan in 2018 was Dan did some lab work with Matt Kerr, which at the time was a 10.5-hour Ironman, and his fat oxidation was 0.5 gram a minute. And then with his coach and further testing and all of the interventions we talked about earlier, diet and training and what have you, he moved that crossover point, and his fat max was 1.8 grams per minute, so more than 3 times increase in grams per minute. So yeah, I mean, and he was doing that at 300 watts, and if you look prior when he started, he could only produce 145 watts it was at that 0.5 gram a minute. So he doubled his power and he tripled his fat oxidation. So what does that mean? Well, that means that at 80% of his VO2 max, he was still mostly burning fat.
Yeah.
So, that we see that in the studies, we see that in our own athletes. So yeah, this is another study that would suggest that you absolutely can drive this change.
Yeah, and I think that again, this really speaks to some of those other studies we were talking about with that that you do, that it may well be like glycogen depleting, like the anecdotal evidence may, the anecdotal evidence may well suggest, like the story that you were just telling us, that it is glycogen sparing to some extent, right? So I think that's
right.
And in addition to that, one of the biggest challenges of an endurance athlete is the GI distress that can occur when you're trying to put in a ton of carbohydrate, each hour to support the training effort, because you have to rely on carbohydrate because your fat oxidation is really low, and so by shifting your ability, your fuel substrate use to be able to burn more fat at that higher intensity, it offloads a little bit of that, so you don't have to rely as much on the exogenous sort of fuel
just
source.
a lower dependency on carbohydrate. And maybe we should do another study just on the whole construct of the gut issues associated with it on one hand, and secondly, obviously there's this movement around gut training, which is highly debatable, but we should do a show on that. I think it's a good topic by itself. But let's come right back now to the study that Dan wrote this blog on that just came out in the last few months, because I guess it's a little, at least at a headline level or the title of the study, it's a little controversial in the spirit of suggesting that in this study where they looked at periodizing carbohydrate use, they suggested that there was, one group on a higher carbohydrate and then there was another group on a lower carbohydrate. But when you actually get into the studies, and we can talk more about it, of the study takeaways, but it was 5 weeks, 17 athletes, fairly actually high caliber athletes, if you look at that VO2 max. And just as from a protocol perspective of the diet that was used in both of these groups, and it was not a crossover, they only did each intervention. But the high carbohydrate group was about 530 grams of carbohydrate per day. And the periodized carbohydrate group was still taking, 400 grams of carbohydrate per day. Now, again, this was also contrasted again, and Dan did highlight this in his blog, against maximal lactate steady state, or maybe some of us would talk about anaerobic threshold. And there was no continuous glucose monitor, so we don't know what really happened to glucose and insulin. So that's how it was set up. What's your perspective on this, Mikki?
Yeah, and I think that to truly test carbohydrate periodization, you would need to ensure, I think, that glycogen levels were depleted across the course of the study to really, truly sort of get a sense of how these athletes are going to train under that condition. And with a carbohydrate intake of around 400 grams a day, it's highly unlikely that was ever the case, that they got to this point where they trained so much that they were able to deplete their glycogen stores. And I'll say that because even though they had training sessions where, of course, there was no carbohydrate prior to training, or they trained to deplete slightly their carbohydrate stores, they got a lot of their carbohydrate post training. So they, which meant that they would have had significant glycogen replenishment after that training session.
Right.
Yeah. So that sort of fundamentally calls into question, to what extent this was really a periodized carbohydrate training study.
Yeah, and I mean, just a couple of things here. We mentioned the study earlier that was done just last year on metabolomics on the Grand Tour UCI cycling team. Iñigo San-Millán, one of the researchers actually based out at Colorado University, he was involved in that study last year. He was involved in this one. So firstly, I think it's great that these researchers are saying, okay, the metabolomics would suggest that fat oxidation is a big deal correlating to performance. So now here's a piece of work that they've done to try to understand, well, what are the levers we've got to work to really improve that or change that? And this first effort, I guess, was an effort of, hey, if we just periodized, but we kept carbohydrate still fairly high, would we see a change? And basically the research says, well, no, you wouldn't. And I think what this is really not so much a question of periodizing. This is, you basically got periodizing by itself is insufficient. It has to actually be the amount of carbohydrate and periodization, i.e. the right fuel and the right time, right, is really what's needed to get a change.
Yeah, and I mean, Dan also in his blog highlighted the protocol with how they tested it, as you mentioned, Leighton. So they used that maximum lactate
steady state.
Yes. which is actually, as you mentioned, it's at that higher threshold of training intensity. It's up where those of us know sort of as that sort of lactate threshold. Whereas to truly test changes in fat oxidation, it makes sense to do it at that lower level of that sort of zone 2 aerobic threshold point, which they didn't do as well. But I agree with you. Like, it's great to have more research in this space. And what I just hope is that people don't read this study and sort of then put the nail in the coffin of carbohydrate periodization without thinking about all of the other research that's gone on before that has shown that it is in fact, it could in fact be a useful tool.
Yeah, as I said, I mean, some of the same researchers in this paper were, have already studied. They know fat oxidation is a real factor in performance. The real question is how to influence and how to impact it. I would just actually one note, it is on this slide, but when we call out 400 grams per day for periodized and 530 grams per day for the higher group, that's making an assumption of a 70 kilogram athlete. But again, if you scale the athlete up and down, obviously that amount will go up and down, but the same applies in terms of its function on insulin and blunting fat oxidation. So I want to now flip this, where while that study suggested that they were looking at low carbohydrate versus high carbohydrate in these two periodized versus non-periodized, in effect, it was really both quite high carbohydrate levels. But what I would like to do is flip this, whereby I would say that that amount of carbohydrate could be having an influence. And so I have a number of studies here where they're showing that these different saccharides, whether it's fructose or glucose, etc., are having different signaling impacts on the body's metabolism, whether it is fat oxidation itself, whether it's mitochondrial density, or even the glucose transporters that are so critical in the muscles. Any kind of call outs you would have here, Mikki, on this being a real thing, again, in your clinical practice and in research?
Yeah, it's such a great question, Leighton. And I guess what I would say is that this our understanding of fructose in the sports performance realm is probably emerging. And so it's going to be a super interesting few years, I think, as we take these protocols that a lot of the sports nutrition product companies are putting into place, and to see how this actually results in the parameters that we're interested in for the athlete. And athletes like us, like the middle-aged, the people who do Ironman triathlon, I'm not necessarily talking about the elite. So I would say that certainly that research is emerging, but there are signs there that it could have some negative downsides, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and I think the really key point that we're bringing out here, look, again, on race day, where it is all about performance and competing, that's why we do it. We love it. Of course, we will use, like you mentioned earlier, all fuels and substrates in order to get over the line quicker. Fructose is one of those, and we've done several videos on the incremental nature of fructose, if you will, to glucose, for the purpose of the performance on race day. What this is really calling out is, hey, this we've seen now where the proponents of high carb have suggested that it's every training session and beyond training. So you have this consistent, continuous flow of fructose and glucose into the body. And that, with some of this early research, is beginning to show that the typical adaptive response we would get out of, zone 2 aerobic exercise gets blunted, right?
Yeah.
And some of those signaling proteins like interleukin-6 gets blunted by this constant, wave of fructose hitting it.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so maybe just coming back and we can close it up here. So I feel like I mentioned, we certainly are continuing to evolve to where we started SFuels 5-6 years ago, to where we're continuing to evolve that as we understand more. We do feel like there's a good body of literature that's starting to make a position that what substrates are used in what amount at different intensities of training and racing does have merit, and improving both different, if you will, metabolic outcomes and performance. But I think to some of the good points that you brought up here, Mikki, too, clearly health implications also.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, Leighton. And I think that this I think that this most recent study hasn't changed. I don't think it would necessarily change the mind of anyone with regards to carbohydrate periodization. And and I don't know, and how I also, as a clinician, feel is that we are our own best investigator as to what works best for us, and if you're working with a skilled practitioner, they can sort of walk you through how you would do a particular protocol to help enhance fat oxidation and get those endurance gains, and also protect your health, if you like, and protect your longevity in the sport, so to speak.
Yeah, and folks, if coaches are watching this video and you'd like us to sit down and walk through the practical application of Right Fuel, Right Time, we're doing that quite often with coaches. We're happy to do that. And yeah, we'll make sure we provide all the links to these research papers below the video here on YouTube. So, Mikki, awesome to chat with you on this. It's an ongoing piece of research always. That's what we love about it. And wishing all the best in your next races. I know this weekend, in fact, I think you've got the Coast to Coast going on in your neck of the woods, one of the most famous races there in New Zealand.
Yeah, exciting stuff, right? And fun fact, I competed in a 2-day, 2-person team event for the Coast to Coast back in, I think, 2002 or something. So some years ago. Amazing course. Yeah. I was rubbish. The course was amazing.
Every course in New Zealand is amazing because you live in one of the most beautiful countries in the world. So great to talk to you. Thanks for spending time with us on this and talking us through some of these studies. Really appreciate it, Mikki.
Yeah, no, love it, Leighton. Thanks so much.
So thanks, folks, for joining us on the Monday Mindshare with Dr. Mikki Williden. And as always, in your training and racing around the world, go longer. Thanks.